Hi, hi. Where would you like me?
You just jump up on the stage.
Okay.
Right, and Lord Geit just gets... Yeah.
Want to sit down?
Yeah.
Well, good morning all, and welcome to King's College London here at Bush House. We're here for the launch of our International School for Government, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome both our guest speaker and contributor, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and of course our founding Executive Director, Alexander Down. A few words from me, perhaps to describe the landscape, the context within which this very important initiative at King's is cited. Globally, society is changing in ways deeper, potentially more challenging than ever before. We are witnessing the rise of a new global middle class. We're seeing expectations rise in relation to education, health, and other key public services. We're wrestling with the impact of social media. Stark debates and dilemmas have opened up in societies around the world about the impact of technology on the labour market and how to sustain welfare systems in the context of aging societies. So the capacity of governments to cope with such global trends and more society-specific public policy challenges is being sorely tested. So too is the challenge of governing well and managing to disagree well. No more pointedly than at present. It's vital in this context that universities play a role in helping to equip the public policy makers of the future with the skills, insights, and mindset needed to cope with all of that. And there's certainly demand. Across the globe, policymakers in local and central government, the media, business and social enterprise are ever hungrier for fresh insights, more data, and better practices and technologies. They need to recruit talented people with strong quantitative, analytical, and creative thinking skills and adaptive, resilient mindsets. Here at King's, we have a deep commitment to serving society, locally, nationally, and globally. We really do see it as our duty to help make the world a better place through education, research, and service. Our strategic vision for 2029 identified the potential to create a transformative model of education in the career development sphere for those working in public policy and public management roles around the world. Thus, the International School for Government was born. The initial work was championed by our Vice Principal Service, Professor Jonathan Grant, who I hope is here somewhere, who, with his team, did excellent work to shape an innovative vision for the school. The International School for Government is a novel intervention to help professionalise policy-making skills across governments, the third and private sectors in the United Kingdom and across the world. The core offer will be a platform of online 5-credit courses which can be accumulated over time, leading to a graduate certificate, a graduate diploma, or a master's degree. This will be supplemented by a signature executive master's program where the culture of policymaking and the ecology of power are explored. In addition to the education offer, the school will also have a strong impact-driven research agenda and a deep commitment to public engagement and policy impact. working in tandem with the Policy Institute at King's and the broader King's community in this regard. That, I hope, sets a little bit of the context. But I'm glad to say how delighted we were at King's to have recruited Alexander Downer to serve as the first executive chair of the new school. Alexander is a close friend to King's, indeed to the United Kingdom, former and distinguished Australian High Commissioner here, former party leader in his own country of Australia, and I think probably the longest serving foreign minister in Australia's history, and with the international focus in mind, serving as a former UN envoy and special advisor to the General Secretary on peace building in Cyprus. He brings an outstanding understanding of government in a domestic and international context to bear on the role that he's undertaken here. And perhaps even less cause to do anything other than warmly welcome Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, 3 times elected to that role, a distinguished figure in his own right, a force in his own political generation, who, in conversation with Alexander, I hope can explore some of the themes that will be touched by the establishment of this international school. I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me begin by thanking Lord Guyot for his fine words and kind words of introduction, and to say what a huge pleasure it is for us at the International School for Government and King's more generally to have with us Tony Blair, the very distinguished former Prime Minister. I came to know Tony Blair when I was the Foreign Minister of Australia and he was the Prime Minister, and there were all sorts of projects we worked very closely on together. And I think it's important for me to say on this occasion that he made a great contribution to building in those days a very close relationship, revitalising really the relationship between Australia and the UK. And why not? Because Tony Blair, as a small child, lived for several years in my hometown of Adelaide. I'd like to claim we went to primary school together. I'm pretty sure we didn't. He lived in a much smarter part of town than me. But nevertheless, he has been a great friend to my country. I know he's been a great friend to King's, and it's a huge pleasure to have him here to do the launch of the International School for Government. So, first of all, former Prime Minister, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you, and congratulations to you and to everyone involved in the International School for Government. It's a great initiative, very timely initiative for reasons we're going to discuss, and thanks to Lord Guyot for his kind introduction.
What we'll do is have a conversation here for 40 minutes or so, and at the end of that, throw the floor open to some questions from all of you as well, democratising the process all the more. So all those questions that you want to ask about presumably current issues, they need to be covered, and so we'll make sure they're covered. But first of all, let's just talk about the issue of governance itself. This is a school for government. We will be running something like 24 short modules on different aspects of governance with the ambition of skilling up civil servants from all around the world, not just UK civil servants, and modern issues of governance. So here's my first question to you. What do you think civil servants, wherever they may be, need to give a priority to in terms of learning?
So the reason I think this is such an important initiative is that I think there's now a much, much greater focus on the processes and machinery and effectiveness of government. And if you look around the world today, and you look at countries that are next door to one another, with roughly the same population, roughly the same resources, roughly the same chances, one succeeds, one fails, it is actually governance and the quality of it that is the difference.
Yeah.
So you could go Colombia and Venezuela, for example. or you could look at Rwanda and Burundi, or you could see Poland and Ukraine. Okay. And actually, the greatest experiment in modern history of the different systems of governance in two neighboring countries is on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, South Korea. I mean, South Korea had, in the 60s, a GDP per head roughly the same as Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries in the world. Today, it's a first world country. Now, the difference is very, very simple. It's in the quality of governance. So, first of all, I think this issue, one of the things that anybody involved in government, if you're a civil servant, what you've got to learn and understand is that this really is the difference. And the second thing is that in a fast-changing world, if you're, as someone in government, you're not learning about the world and learning how it's changing, then you're not really capable of implementing the programs necessary to keep your government up to pace with the changes that are going on. So what you often find with bureaucracies around the world is that they're brilliant at managing the status quo. In fact, they've got something of a genius for it, actually. But they're not good at implementing change. And yet, in today's world, it's all about the scope, scale, and speed of change. And I think the thing is, because this is not, hopefully in time, at least you will not just be addressing civil servants, but also politicians. The thing that came to fascinate me about the processes of government is that when you're in opposition as a politician, it's all about what you say. And essentially, the skill set that matters is to be a great communicator. You're a great persuader. So when you're in opposition, you've got to persuade people to change the government, but it's all about the process of talking. Right? When you come into government, you suddenly realize that not merely is that skill set often redundant, or at least hugely diminished in importance, it's still important, obviously, to communicate and persuade, but that when you're actually in government, it's all about doing. And doing is infinitely harder than saying. And what you then realize is that unless you then have executive skills to go alongside the persuasive skills, then you end up just talking. And I remember two things that really struck me when I came into Downing Street. The first was that, you know, I had this idea we'd won a landslide victory. I was the prime minister. I thought I was a pretty powerful person, obviously. And, you know, I thought that if I sat at the cabinet table and took a decision, something happened. And it took me a while to realize, no, nothing happened just because you took the decision. It only happened if you focused on the process of implementation and delivery. And the other thing that occurred to me is that it took me a long time to get out of the rhythm of campaigning and into the rhythm of governing. And I remember about a year into my time in office, and I said to my press people, look, you know, I'm learning a lot about this. I mean, I just want to go out and be very honest with people that I'm kind of learning on the job, basically. And they said, no, you can't say that. The country will panic. No. The country will panic. But the reality is you come in, and if you haven't at least got some grasp of how this process of governing goes on, you are learning on the job, is the truth. And what you notice, and this is the work my institute does around the world on governance, where we work with governments and have teams of people go and live and work in the country, work alongside the president, prime minister of those countries. What you learn over time is that it really is all about the capability to govern, and over time you realize that that is also subject to certain clear principles that can be learned and taught. And so, you know, what you're trying to do here is, I think, very valuable, because it's showing people that you should regard this process of government not just about being part of some great bureaucracy, but actually itself an intellectual and workplace challenge for which there are lessons that can be learnt and can be applied, because basically the other thing you find in government is, even though countries are vastly different and circumstances are vastly different, the processes of governing are really quite the same. So this is why you're doing your International School for Government, and we do what we do at the Institute.
So you're really arguing that the skill set that civil servants need is the same here in the UK as it might be in Ghana or it might be in the Solomon Islands or Korea.
Yeah.
That they need a particular array of skills, and those skills have to focus on implementation of policy. So you think it's less, well, I suppose on occasions a government has some really bad policies. I've seen that. But
so it's focusing on, I think, so when we talk to we usually talk to the political leaders, but it applies to their civil servants as well. I will say I'd say there's like the 4 Ps of sort of political leadership, small P political leadership when you're in office. The first is prioritization. You know, if you promise to get everything done, you'll get nothing done. I mean, basically that's the lesson of government. You've got to prioritize. You've got to focus. If you've got a term of government, let's say it's 4 years or 5. I mean, you guys, it was 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah. Anyway,
more than enough when you're in opposition.
but never enough when you're in government. So but if you're realistically going to get certain things done, then you're going to have to prioritize. That's the first thing. The second thing is policy does matter. You see, one of the problems in politics is that at a certain level, it's a very intellectual business. At a certain level, it's a very crude business. But at a certain level, it's a very intellectual business. What the right healthcare policy is requires a detailed study of healthcare. And there's no way out of that just by some line in a manifesto. I mean, one of the most alarming things that happened to me when I came into government, because I had a slight inkling that, you know, manifestos were manifestos, but, you know, be a little careful of treating them too literally. And I remember the head of the civil service, Robin Butler, saying to me at the time, we've all been studying the manifesto, we're all ready to implement it, kind of line by line. I mean, whoa, I mean, you know, let's do a little bit of a review of certain parts before we get to too literal. But the fact is, policy matters, right? So the second thing is you've got to have the policy capability, and you've got to be sure that the policy that you're implementing is going to be effective. Right? One of the things, again, I learned about reform, because in a world of change, all governments are trying to reform and have got to reform. But one of the things you learn is this. Reform is one of these things that everyone is in favor of in principle. Everyone is against in particular. Right? So the moment you make a reform, I actually did a first pension reform, and after about a year, I said to my guys, hey, you did this pension reform. There doesn't appear to be much opposition to it. And they said, no, it's great. There's no real opposition. And then I realized it's because we hadn't really reformed. I mean, the next time we did, a lot of opposition. But the fact is, so you have to get that policy right. Okay, that's the second thing. The third thing is the personnel. You know, it really matters. If you're a civil servant, you've got to build your team as well. If you're a politician, build your team. Any politician who's ever been in office knows if you've got 3 or 4 really capable people around you, you can make everything happen. If you don't have that capacity and that talent around you, it's like anything else. It's like running anything else. It depends on the people. It's the most obvious thing in the world to say, but people often don't appreciate it. And then the fourth P is performance management. Track it to see it's done. Make it measurable. And, you know, but people sort of say, well, you can't import the private sector into the public sector. I think this is wrong at a number of different levels. It's obviously right at one level, but it's wrong in the sense that many of the processes of, you know, performance management, of ensuring that you have measurable objectives and actually tracking that they're being done, the things that the private sector would do as of course, really are effective and sensible in government. Now you know, we used to get criticized for having too precise targets and so on and so forth, but in the end, what you realize is if people don't, if you're not directing your civil service to certain goals, things don't happen. So that's, you know, that's what I learned about it. And really those 4 Ps apply. You know, we work in many, many different African countries today and outside of Africa. We're in about 20 different countries with teams of people. But they're all lessons that I kind of learned from my time in Downing Street here. And although the circumstances are different and the challenges are different, the processes, those 4 Ps, if you like, aren't really different.
But we're going through I think, you know, not to exaggerate this too much, but we're going through a huge transition in terms of technology in particular. The way different, not just people, but countries interact with each other and their capacity to interact. What do you think, what bearing do you think that has on this sort of the 4Ps and the priorities? I mean, governments have to deal with very rapid and very dramatic change very quickly now.
Right, so my basic theory of politics today is that the world of politics does not really understand the world of change. And you have change makers and policymakers operating separately from each other. The technological revolution we're living through is, in my view, the equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution. In other words, it touches every single aspect of life. It's going to change everything. It should be the single most important focus of the political debate because it is the thing that is changing everything. But the problem is very, very simple. And it's that many of those people in government, civil servants and politicians, don't really understand it. And what you don't understand, you fear, and what you fear, you generally dislike. So there's a real risk, in my view, that we're failing to educate today's decision makers, whether in civil service or in politics, about technology, how it's changing the world, and what they do about it. So one part of my institute work is to set up a tech unit, which we're just creating now, which is specifically engaging policymakers with change makers. But you know, I often speak to people in the tech sector who, for all sorts of obvious reasons, it's not in their psyche to engage much with government. In fact, less they have to do government better. But I keep saying to them, if you're changing the world, politics is going to take an interest in you. And I said this constantly to the behemoths in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. If you guys don't end up becoming part of a debate about the public interest in relation to your power, the politicians are just going to grab you one day and regulate you in ways that may not be very sensible, by the way. But you know, the one thing politicians do understand is how to regulate. So I think this technology thing is very important. So I know one part of your modules is going to be around technology. But this is incredibly important. Technology in government, also how you digitalize government, that's also a whole area of expertise. But the other thing is, when I left office, technology was still, you know, you had health, education, industry, defense, agriculture, whatever, technology. Right? Today, technology it overarches everything. So your healthcare system should be revolutionized around technology. We educate people differently as a result of technology. Even transport is going to change as a result of technology. Industry will change. I mean, if you look at how the car industry, for example, will change over the next 15 years, it's going to become essentially electric and driverless. It's a vast revolution. It's huge implications. So how many people in government are studying this? So this dislocation between what's happening in the real world and the world of politics is very important. That's one thing your institute and places like mine have got to try and bridge that gulf, because otherwise it will, you know, otherwise people will, in the end, I think this is what I fear will happen in politics, is that people will start to see this technological revolution as the next target of populism, which really is not sensible, because actually there are enormous benefits that will come with the technology, as well as challenges. And you've got access to these benefits, but to do that you have to understand it, and you have to weave this technological revolution into a narrative about the future that is optimistic for people.
So here is perhaps a statement of the obvious that when you're having such dramatic change, such dramatic technological change, it puts institutions, it puts the status quo under huge pressure. And people see change all around them. They fear that artificial intelligence is going to take jobs. I mean, they might not think their own jobs, but jobs more generally away from them. The politicians themselves are wrestling with the impact of this technology on their daily lives, for example. I've sat with politicians, with ministers who spend most of their time just looking at their mobile phones to see what the Twitter feed and Facebook feed is, what people are saying about them. Probably not the most productive use of their time. Or is it? I suspect not. So you're seeing huge change. Do you think there needs to be institutional change? Let's just focus on the UK. I mean, here in the UK, you've had pride yourselves on the ancient institutions which have served you so well over the hundreds of years. but is there going to have to be some institutional change to deal with this, or are public pressure, and really not all, and are public pressures coming out of all this technological change going to make life still more difficult for politicians?
Yeah, I think it's a really big question and unresolved one. So first of all, I think social media is a revolutionary phenomenon. And I think it revolutionizes everything it touches, including politics. So, I mean, we may talk a bit about populism later, but I think there are objective reasons for populism around grievances that people have, cultural and economic challenges. But I think there's one very, very large part of it is social media itself. Because it transforms the business of politics. And I don't think in a particularly healthy way, to be frank. I mean, in one sense, it allows you to communicate more easily with people.
Democratizes it more, perhaps.
It does in one sense, but it's democracy. I think one of the things we're learning about democracy is that it's got a content as well as a form. And, you know, the quality of the debate and the quality of the information and the quality of the structure within which you're exchanging views is also important. And the trouble with social media is, I mean, this is probably not a very diplomatic thing to say, but it's kind of platform of the loudmouth, really, isn't it? You know, I mean, look, most people don't go around expressing their opinions in a very rude and abusive way. But on social media, that is literally what you...
Yeah, they go feral.
That's how it works. So, you know, you read the newspaper article, I don't mean those about myself, but about anyone or anything, and you read the comments underneath, you think, oh my God, what do these people do? I mean, they just sit there and write this sort of...
I try not to read them, actually.
You know, it's wise not to, but occasionally it's an education, because then, you know, the fact is, I mean, quite a part of the fact you then learn how many crazy people there are, sort of thing, but it's also that you realize that, as it were, the discourse with social media as the medium is a very rough discourse. Now, it's not always bad, by the way. And anyway, it's a fact. There's no point in moaning about it too much. But, you know, worries me when I talk to politicians today, because for conventional politicians, this is disorienting. For the new breed of politician, they're exploiting it, and very effectively. But for the conventional politician is prepared to step out ahead, but they kind of need some attachment to the people behind. You don't want to step out and then find there's just stepped out into a great void and there's no one behind you. So politicians over the years have developed ways of keeping in touch with public opinion, so that even if you're stepping out, you're not stepping out so far. Now, the social media disorients you, because I have politicians say to me, you know, well, I have 100,000 people on Twitter saying X. And I say to them, yeah, but is that 100,000 people representative of like 10 million or 1 million or maybe 150,000? I mean, you've got to know that before you start shifting your policy base or thinking, you know, you're misreading the situation. So I think it's a very, very tough question. I also think there's another thing that's very bizarre about the way the world of the media works today. So I get most of my news on my mobile phone. And I will probably read as much BBC News today as I see, okay? And if I'm reading a newspaper, I might well see video content. And yet you've got one part, the broadcast part, that's very heavily regulated, and the other that isn't. Okay, so you've got all sorts of, so there's all sorts of issues around how we frame debates, and how do we, for example, there's been a lot of talk about this idea of sort of, you know, groups of citizens that come together and you have a more structured form of debate around certain issues. And I used to be pretty dismissive of all that stuff as a bit sort of, you know, pie in the sky, but I'm less so now. I think you're also going to have to look for ways within democracy of creating forums where people can debate and exchange views without feeling, you know, you're going to be, you know, trampled on if you, you know, if you say something that offends someone. So,
it's possible, isn't it, that these people on social media who unload the fusillade of abuse, their foul language, they're a tiny minority of people who have found this platform and use it vigorously. But most people are not behaving in that way, even on social media. So in Australia, we recently had an election, and the government was re-elected. The Prime Minister talked about the quiet Australians who just went about their daily lives. And then there are the loud Australians. That's quite a lot of them, of course. There are 11 of them, I noticed, in Old Trafford the other day. And they had every right to be loud.
I thought you were going to be too diplomatic to mention that, but yeah.
But the people who are not really, which in my country and probably in this country, the majority of people are not all that politically engaged day by day. They're not involved in this sort of activity. And isn't it important to remember that as a governor?
It is important, but I think you've got to qualify it with two things. First of all, you know, they do get an outsized amount of the publicity. I mean, I would say to people, look, we're having a reasonable discussion here, we're on the stage, right? Suddenly a fight breaks out in the audience, which is more interesting. You and I having a discussion about governance on stage, or two people beating up each other. I mean, it's a problem.
Not as a result of what we said,
well,
hopefully.
Maybe not. But the second thing is, I think it has a huge impact on political parties. I think it drives the activists in political parties from the more extreme elements of the political activism. It gives them a much greater, I was going to say momentum, but maybe that's, but it gives them a niche in the political debate. I think if you look at what's happened to traditional parties of the centre-right and centre-left, they have moved very significantly to the left and to the right on the whole. Actually, Australia, maybe not so much, but but you can see, you know, you look around the Western world today, and that is a pattern that I think is partly driven by the impact of social media on party organisation.
Mm. So you've seen what the media like to sometimes call the rise of populism, particularly perhaps in Europe and North America, but actually, interestingly enough, not particularly in Australia, which I don't think populism is quite the right word myself, because all politicians would like to be popular. I remember dreaming of being popular once. I gave up after a while. But I think they're more nationalists. And my sense is that they're all that we've been talking about, which, by the way, I warmly embrace what you've been saying, technological change, openness, globalization, it's sometimes called. If you want to make your country work, you really have to embrace that paradigm. However, within countries, people still have a sense of nationalism and national pride, and pride in their culture and traditions and ways of life. So do you think it's a great challenge for political leaders to balance that sense of nationalism, if we could call it that, with globalization, and that many have failed to understand this, and maybe moved ahead too quickly and too enthusiastically with globalization, which is a sense to their credit, but not taken into account the sensitivities of national sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point. There's definitely a risk of that. I mean, first of all, I mean, I agree with you in this sense that, you've got to distinguish between policies that are popular and policies that are populist. I mean, by populism, I mean people who, in a sense, ride the anger rather than provide the answer. In other words, the populist takes a grievance, exploits it, and really points the finger of blame at something or someone. Whereas I think proper politics should be about providing solutions. And I think a lot of the populists don't really provide solutions. But what drives it, yes, I think the questions of national identity are for sure important. I think it's part economic and part cultural. But I think there's a tendency of people from my political position, which is on the center-left, to downplay the cultural. But I think the cultural is as important as the economic in how politics is changing. And the immigration issue is a huge issue all over the Western world. And it's because people feel their societies are changing and there's anxiety about it. Yeah. Now, my view is populists exploit the grievance, but they don't create it. And therefore, what I always say to people in my own persuasion is you've got to address the underlying problems. So those have been, since the financial crisis, stagnant incomes for a section of the population, for sure. There is a sense, particularly after fiscal adjustments, deep cuts, austerity, if you like, that certain communities have had a lot of lifelines cut, and they feel left behind and marginalized. And you know, there's no doubt at all that there is a cultural divide, and that cultural divide opened up for sure around Brexit. I mean, that was a classic instance of something that was, I think, as much cultural as it was economic, for sure. And I think you can point the same to the election of President Trump in America. So I think this is, you know, now my answer to these things is you've got to deal with the underlying grievances. In other words, you've got to recognize there are genuine anxieties about immigration and deal with it, rather than simply telling people that they can't express those anxieties. Because if you don't deal with the grievances, someone will come along and exploit it. But I think, you know, where we are right now in Western politics is the question is, to me, is can the centre-right and centre-left rediscover their mojo, as it were, and recapture the political agenda? I mean, that's the open challenge.
I wouldn't be doing my job here today if I didn't, finally, before I ask the floor if they'd like to ask some questions, get into some discussion with you about the EU and Brexit and so on. So I'm an outsider, as in I'm a foreigner here. And I'm just desperately trying to understand the complexities of your great nation. So count me as...
You've got that in common with the great nation right now, I think.
Nation.
Nations.
So I'm sort of reasonably neutral. I'm certainly unemotional about this issue myself. But the first question, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about this, is a question you don't very often hear people asking. Why is it in the UK, as distinct from other members of the European Union, that the European Union has such a huge body of opposition? It might be 52%, or it might be, you know, slightly less or slightly more. But why is the EU so unpopular in the UK, distinct from other countries, in other countries?
So first of all, I think it's important, in one sense, Alexander, to correct that. I mean, I think many of the issues that gave rise to Brexit, you could find all over Europe.
But that's not been the reaction in those countries, has
Well, they
it?
haven't had a referendum.
No, well.
Have you had a referendum? At certain points in the last few years, you would have had quite a rocky situation in many European countries. So, because Europe has become as it were, the receptacle for a lot of that anxiety and grievance, and particularly just going back in 2016 at the height of the migration thing with the question of the Syrian refugees and so on, I think, you know, if you look at Italy today, Italy back 10 years ago would have been one of the most pro-European countries, and today it isn't. Right? So I think one's got to qualify this.
Although even Salvini is in favour of staying in the European Union.
He is indeed, and in favour of staying in the euro ultimately as well. But I just point out that you know, you can't say it's a simply British phenomenon, but we held the referendum. And I think you're right in this sense, that I think the British have always felt, you know, partly I think because we weren't there at the beginning, and because joining was actually quite a struggle for us, we've always felt slightly to one side in the European debate. Now, the truth of the matter is that Britain has always been a key player in holding the balance of power in Europe for centuries. And, you know, the reasons for Europe today, as I keep explaining to people, not really the same as they were in my father's generation. The reasons for Europe then were peace. You know, Europe is a continent that had been at war for centuries and had 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. But if you fast forward to today, the rationale for Europe's not peace but power. You know, it's changing geopolitics in which you're going to have America, China, probably India, in time for reasons of population. Those are going to be the giants of the world. And if you want to be able to sit at the same table as the giants, you've got to be in a strong regional bloc, or you have others around you collectively. And that's the reason for Europe today. And Europe is weaker without Britain, and Britain's weaker without Europe. And so, although I think there are many economic reasons for Britain staying in Europe, the principal reason for me, at least, apart from the economics, is the politics, because there's just a geopolitical imperative in the end. Otherwise, you're not of the weight and size to advance your influence and interests. So this is, this is what it's about. But you're right in this sense that it's become the issue around which all these questions of populism now play out. I would just point out one thing, though. In 2015, Britain had a general election, which David Cameron won with a majority, and Europe barely featured. I mean, literally barely featured. I think I made a speech on Europe in the campaign, and it lasted about half an hour of the news cycle, and that was about it. So our politics really then took on a new shape, in a sense, once we had the referendum. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't a real issue, and there wasn't real agitation behind it, but it suddenly became, it went from being an issue, and so in 2015, pretty much an also-ran issue. Then in 2016, it became the question and has remained like this for the next 3 or so years.
It might have been an issue for some people because to win that election, Cameron had to get the UKIP vote down, and the way he got the UKIP vote down was by promising to have a referendum.
Well, there's a case for that, although, as I said, what's remarkable is how little it really featured.
What should the European Union do? I mean, you know, if we're not sure how this is all going to play out, but if they lose the UK, the second biggest country in the European Union by many measures, and the one with the most soft power in the world by quite a margin, they lose the UK, what should the European, even if they don't, somehow clings on, what should the European Union be doing structurally and politically to engage better with the European population?
Focus on the things that matter practically to people. I mean, I dealt with this a long, you know, one of the things is, if you're strongly opposed to Brexit, which I am, one of the things is people kind of assume, therefore, that you're really in favor of everything that Europe does. I mean, I spent 10 years dealing with Europe. I could write you a PhD thesis on what the weaknesses of the system are and how many things need to change. It's just that in the end, I think it's much more sensible to be part of it than out of it. But what Europe should do is get out of constant institutional revision and focus on the things that really matter that Europe should be doing. And one of those things, by the way, is completing the single market rather than undermining it. But another is building a common energy policy, making sure that you, for example, on education, there are lots of things that Europe do Europe-wide around education. How we establish technology winners in Europe. I mean, how many technology winners do we have in Europe that are all in America or China? Or in time to come, they may be in India. So why isn't Europe up there? You've got common defense policy. We are absolutely dependent on the US. Now, of course, we have NATO, but the fact is, you know, the European defense cooperation, I don't mean one European army, that's very practical at all, but I mean better defense cooperation in building the assets necessary to be able to hold your own in defense terms would be very important. One of the places my foundation, my institute works in is the Sahel, which is that band of countries across the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa. It is the next flashpoint in the world, by the way. You've got countries with growing poverty, exploding populations, radicalization, and poor institutions. And a lot of weapons around. So this is, you know, this is bound to be an area where we're going to face problems. They're on our doorstep, right? But Europe is going to find it extremely difficult to deal with the security aspects of that without the help of America. Okay, so these are the things that Europe should be concentrating on. Focused on those things, it would win support because it's all in the end. And also, you need, frankly, to have a rebalancing within the Eurozone so that you're stimulating investment and spending within the German economy that then will have an impact on the other economies of Europe. So these are the things that Europe should be focused on. And there's lots of changes that could be made, but they're policy changes. The trouble is Europe, as I once said to the European Parliament when I was President of the European Union in 2005 is we spend all our time looking inwards at the institutions in order to bring them closer to the people. And every time we do that, the people move further away. So if you focused on output, that would be important.
Might be a pity you didn't become the President of the European Council, because listening to you reminds me that President Sarkozy said to me just the other day when he and I were at a conference together that he really wanted you to be the President of the European Council, but apparently Angela Merkel less keen on having a powerful figure as the President of the Council.
I don't know. I don't think so, actually. I think there are lots of different reasons, really. Also, I didn't really fit into the category of from one particular side of politics or the other. That was anyway.
So, talking of politics, we're at some stage here moving into an election. So all of the politics today, it's about Brexit, but it's more than that. It's about preparing for an election. The Conservatives want an election before the 31st of October because that'll maximise their electoral support. Labour definitely don't want one before the 31st of October because they think they'll lose that, but after the 31st of October they think they can do better. What do you think about what's going on?
I think we're missing a fundamental point of principle. If Parliament's blocked over Brexit, and to deblock it, you need to go back to the people. Go back to the people on the issue of Brexit. Go back and ask them whether they want the government's proposition on Brexit or whether they want to stay. That's the obvious way out of this. Because if you mix up the question of Brexit with general election, you're in a situation where a general election by its very nature involves lots of different issues, not just the Brexit issue. And let's be clear, the reason why people want to mix the two up together is they think there's a political advantage in mixing them up. So what Boris Johnson thinks is, look, if I have a Brexit general election, I can say to people, look, it's no deal, or you get Jeremy Corbyn, now what do you want? And knowing, moreover, that he will, in a general election, provided he can pull the Brexit party towards him by essentially adopting their policy, he will then have a split opposition between Labour and the Lib Dems. And in our electoral system, which is first past the post, that can deliver a majority for him. So the point is, A general election is wrong in principle because if the specific issue is Brexit, go to the people on Brexit. B, there's no guarantee it won't be a hung parliament again, in which case you go further forward. And C, you can end up in the bizarre situation where let's just suppose the Conservatives manage to win a majority with, say, 35 to 40% of the vote. They will then claim a mandate for no deal, when actually if you add the votes of all the parties opposed to no deal together, they'll come to more than the Conservative vote. So this is a completely undemocratic way of deciding it. By all means have a general election, just don't mix the two issues up.
So do you think, though, that it's been a mistake? The referendum was a mistake. You didn't like the result of the referendum, that's a different point. But the idea of having a referendum, the idea of direct democracy is a mistake, and you should stick with the sort of Edmund Burke principle that, you know, an MP should make her or his decisions based on their best judgment and let the electors decide at the end of their term. By the way, after he made that speech to the electors of Bristol, he lost his seat.
There you go.
So there's a thought there, I think.
No, I do in general terms, but the speech I actually made in the 2015 general election was to say why I thought a referendum was a bad idea. But we've had it. And if you're...
It's a bad idea. Why is the second one a good idea? Because you didn't like the result of the first one?
No, because you've already taken the decision first time round by referendum. So if you're blocked in Parliament... Because why are we in this situation? We're in this situation because Brexit can mean at least 3 different forms of Brexit. You can have a hard Brexit, which is still a negotiated deal, but it's a free trade arrangement similar to Canada has with the EU. You can have a soft Brexit, which means you exit the political structures but stay in the trading system of the EU, the single market and the customs union. Or you can have no deal, which means you go out of both but without any arrangement or agreement. Right? 3 different propositions. Actually, Parliament has never been asked in a proper structured way to decide which of those 3 propositions
They couldn't agree on any of them.
Well, if they can't agree, then you're going to have to go back to the people and say, what did you mean? And if it's If it's no deal that the government's agitating for, go back and put that and say, do you want it or do you want to stay? So this is not, when people say, well, how can you, once they've decided the referendum, can you go back? First of all, I think there's absolutely nothing undemocratic, especially after 3 years of this mess and a decision of this magnitude, saying to people, look, after all the experience we've got, and now we have a specific proposition from government, do you prefer that future to the one of staying? I don't think there's anything undemocratic about it. But more than that, once it's accepted by everyone, including by the government, including by the Prime Minister, that you have to go back to the people, why mix the general up with the particular? Why have a general election and not a referendum? And the answer is because there is a political reason for trying to wrap up the Brexit question in a general election, which is so that you can effectively say, my proposition may be unpopular, but you've got a more unpopular one on the other side. No, it shouldn't be like that. It should be a choice on the issue. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why politicians don't take this way out. It's also, by the way, Boris Johnson's way out. If Boris Johnson was smart, he'd say, okay, I'm now blocked in Parliament. I'm going to go back to the people. We're going to go back on the specific issue. What's his biggest risk in the general election? His biggest risk is actually mixing up. I mean, he's doing it because he thinks you can get no deal as a result of it, but it's also a risk because he could end up with a hung Parliament. Whereas he might think, if he was facing Jeremy Corbyn in a straightforward election, absent the Brexit issue, he might feel stronger.
He might or he might not. I don't know the answer to that. So talking of democracy, let's democratise this. Oh, my God. So with the School for Government brochure and the red tie.
Tony, first of all, thank you for coming.
So can you explain who you are to everybody?
Nick Butler, a visiting professor here at King's. Thank you, first of all, for coming to King's and helping to launch this initiative. My question was about populism. It seems to me the populists have moved from social media and commenting on other people's activities and writing letters in green ink, and they've moved into power, not just in America, but also here. And I wonder if you could reflect on how an institute for government teaches politicians and civil servants how to work in an environment where facts and rational analysis matters less than the slogan on the side of a bus.
I'm not sure anything's changed there over the years, but
I think what's going to happen in the end is that people are going to have to go through this experience in order to emerge better educated on the other side of it. I mean, it's interesting if you look at Greece, which after all is a country that's gone through a pretty agonizing period and taken tougher decisions than probably any country has taken in the Western world and in modern political history. They went through a period of populism and have now restored basically a moderate centre-right government. And I think what we should do is just continue to argue cases to what actually works and delivers. But I do think that populism basically is driven by pessimism. You know, in a world of pessimism, you look for someone to blame. In a world of optimism, you're looking for your opportunities. And that's why I think this technology thing is so important, because it is the revolution that's happening. And the first group of politicians that take this technological revolution and weave it into a narrative of optimism and refocus politics around how we handle its challenges and access its benefits is going to succeed. And that, in the end, you know, people default to the politics of dislike and sectarianism and hatred in circumstances where they feel angry because they feel disempowered and without hope. And you've got to give them that back. And therefore, even though I think it would be very, very difficult for a period of time, it's still important for us to argue that facts are facts, for us to argue that there are policies that work and that they're better than slogans that don't, and for us to argue that there is a way forward to the future, that you can plot with some form of optimism and hope about it.
Although I think the style of politics has always been a little bit that. The lady back there in the middle.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Super interesting
Remember
discussion.
to describe who you are. You're not getting away with anonymity here.
I'm delighted. I'm Robin Scott. I'm co-founder and CEO of Apolitical, which is a learning platform for government. And I'm going to ask an apolitical question in the spirit of that. So the need for government to learn about the 21st century real world is obvious. I'm interested in how you create the space and the incentives. So we recently surveyed 1,000 of our members from more than 90 countries about learning. And these are, on average, quite senior. 50% of them manage teams. And when we asked them how much time they had for learning, more than 50%, more than half, said they only had a couple of hours. They couldn't learn anything that took more than a couple of hours. How do you change that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. I mean, one of the things I learned about politics is you have to have what I used to call strategic time. In other words, time where you sit and think. And I got into the habit as Prime Minister of every month I would have at least one day where I would sit with a close group of people, or sometimes even literally just sit and think through what I used to call it, what's it all about, Alfie moment, you know, like, what are we trying to do here? Where are we going? And what's it all about? And what are the things, what are the gaps in our knowledge that we need to fill? So I think one of the things that is going to have to happen in the end is that we also enrich the dialogue with the electorate so that they understand that, you know, politicians in the end are people. I mean, and by the way, in our systems, they're elected by the people. So you've got this slightly weird idea that, you know, Parliament is the enemy of the people. I mean, it's a bit of an odd notion. So what you've got to do is people have got to understand members of Parliament and politicians, they need this time to study and to learn. And then we need to be much more imaginative about how people can interact as serving politicians with the real world outside. You know, we need to be finding ways of them doing that, which we don't have at the moment. And again, in our system today, often what will happen is someone will leave university, like King's, come and be a researcher for an MB. A few years later, come and be a candidate. A few years after that, become an MP. They've never actually gone out and worked in the real world. And I think this is, over time, this is going to diminish both the gene pool that we bring into politics and the capability. So I think this is a really, really important question. And I think one of the things that all of this turmoil in politics is going to teach us is we're going to have some first principle discussions about what it means to be a democracy, how we operate it, how we attract the right sort of people into it, how we expand the opportunities for people to engage in it, and how we get, in a world that's no longer deferential, how we get to an engagement between politicians and public that is not one of demands on the one side and, you know, defensive mechanisms on the other.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asian Middle East Forum. Mr. Blair, how would you resolve the fractured relationship with Iran? And specifically looking at the nuclear issue and looking at the question of Nazarene Radcliffe, which is a thorn in relations between the UK and Iran. And there doesn't seem to be much success by successive foreign secretaries up until now. Do you see any way out of this issue that we can actually bring her home? And secondly, do you see a role for Britain to play in bringing the US into the fold, in having better relations with Iran today?
I mean, I think, you know, I dealt with this a lot in government. I mean, I think the problem is whether those in effective power in Iran really want to make change. I mean, I'm not against the engagement at all, and I remember engaging strongly with President Khatami at the time in the early part of the century. I find it hard to see how there can be an engagement with Iran that's going to be productive unless they really decide they're going to change their essential position in the region. And this is the problem I feel with it. I'm not against doing it, and obviously Britain has a particular relationship with the US, and it's got a long, though not often very positive future with Iran, frankly. But ultimately, I think it's hard for me to see how this is going to change unless it's a real change of attitude on the part of the regime. That's not to say we shouldn't engage. I'm perfectly happy always to engage. I think it's sensible to do that. And I certainly don't criticize any political leader for engagement. But I'm skeptical whether it can succeed.
I know from experience those consular cases trying to
That's
release
hugely
people,
difficult.
I mean...
Because they become pawns in the, they just become pawns in the battle, I'm afraid.
And, you know, she's not subject to British law. She's subject to Iranian law. And you can't change Iranian law. I mean, it is as it is. The BBC. I'm sorry to say this is the last question. I'm getting all sorts of wind-up signs from my team.
James Landell, BBC. First of all, Mr. Blair, could you tell us, give us your assessment of the Labour Party's current policy on Brexit, such that it is? And secondly, can I ask a specific question about a specific part of government? How do you think that diplomacy should change to adapt to the information revolution that you've outlined today, when their political principles are expressing their diplomacy at unexpected times of night on Twitter, when political leaders WhatsApp each other secretly without telling their diplomats what's happening, when diplomats cannot be sure that their advice necessarily is going to remain secret? How do you think they should adapt as a sort of cadre of government officials to the changes that you've outlined?
On the second part, I think it's a great question. Look, I think, I'm not sure I have all the answers to it, but it is, again, a completely revolutionary world for the diplomats. I mean, you know, what happened to Kim Darroch, for example, in the USA is a classic example. You know, diplomats have to be able to express themselves freely. They will now hesitate to do that. They need to know what their governments are thinking, otherwise they look out of touch with their masters back home. Often today, they're not. So no, I think this is a huge problem. And again, it's one of these things where we're going to have to decide how we create effective systems in a world that's got this revolutionary social media environment to it. So I honestly don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a fundamentally difficult question. I mean, again, if I was back in government today, I think I would concentrate on at least trying to bring some order and discipline. I mean, I think anyone who's dealing with communications today, by the way, is looking for ways to make them secure, and there are ways at least you can make them more secure. But how can you conduct government unless you can have frank conversations with people of a confidential nature? It's an impossible situation, and you need your diplomats to be capable of articulating the views of your government with reasonable coherence. Otherwise, you know, they're regarded as of no effect or respect to the host government. So that's very difficult, which is also difficult describing the Labour Party's position in relation to the referendum, but that's different reasons. Look, it's work in progress. Let me put it like that. I mean, I think the blunt truth is that the majority of the Labour Party is in favour of staying, but there are two separate things here. And I hope the Labour Party eventually gets to this position. And to be fair to the leadership, in these last weeks, they have cooperated with people across party lines in order to block an election, which I think would be a mistake, right? But there are two things that I think we've got to get to. The first is, it is wrong as a matter of principle to mix the general election up with the specific Brexit question, which should be put to people back in a referendum, if you want the people to break the deadlock. And that is a position that is right in November as well as right in October. And secondly, there's no delay for Brexit that's going to be acceptable unless it's to agree a process of resolution. And the process of resolution for Brexit has been for 3 years and remains. You make Parliament vote on the options, the different forms of Brexit, and choose one. And if they can't, then the government should go back to the people with a specific proposition from the government against which you put the Remain proposition. And that is the obvious way to settle this. It's been the case from the very beginning. And the truth is, if the British people end up having a general election on Brexit, you're going to mix up issues that should be kept separate. You may not even get a clear result, and you could end up in a bizarre situation where you're essentially just saying to people, we're going to put unpopular propositions before you, and you've just got to choose between a rock and a hard place which one you like least. So this is, if the Labour Party right now shows strong leadership, and as I say, in these last few weeks, they've been, in my view, doing the right thing, the resolution of Brexit is actually in the hands of the Labour Party and its leadership today. And if it's sensible about it, there is a path to resolution, which is consistent with principle, and will do what I'm sure the overwhelming majority of British people, whether they remain or leave, want, which is to get the Brexit thing done, dusted, and over with, and resolved.
So the Labour Party's position at the moment, I'm trying to remember, I think their position at the moment is that they take pretty much the Theresa May withdrawal agreement, perhaps adjust it here or there, and then put that to a referendum. And in the referendum, they'd argue against the agreement they had made with the European Union. I think that's the position. Anyway, I am, of course, as you know, very neutral. Yeah. Very neutral. Look, on behalf of all of you, I want to say I thought, I don't know, it's probably not a popular thing to say these days, but I thought it was a masterclass. I thought you did a fantastic job. And thank you so much for explaining, you know, setting aside all the Brexit malarkey, the whole issue of governance in the modern era with this huge technological change. I think what you had to say was both wise and informative, educative, and really helpful to us as a school for government. And I really, from the bottom of my heart, want to say how much I appreciate you coming along here today to launch the school. You were a great partner when we were both in government. Once John Howard and I sat down together during your second last election, might have been your last election, and we said to each other, just the two of us, and we said to each other, so if we were British, who do you really reckon we'd vote for? We looked at each other and said, it's embarrassing, isn't it? But we'd have to vote for Blair, I suppose. Anyway, it's a great performance. Thank you very much, and really appreciate you coming. We look forward to working with you.